This video is intended to show you how to remove the sandpaper in a Woodmaster 3875. First thing you need to do is depower the machine. Grab yourself a straight edge, Sharpie, and a blade. Then we're going to go ahead and open up the hood by removing that bolt right there and that bolt right there. So this is what our sanding belt looks like. As you can see right here, we've got a bunch of gummies on there. I could grind that off with a eraser, but in this case I'm actually just going to go ahead and replace the entirety of the sandpaper. What I want you to notice is that the sandpaper is currently being wound in a spiral this direction, so keep note of that after I remove it. When you remove the sandpaper, don't damage it because we're going to use that as a template later on. If you do not have sandpaper already installed, jump over to the manual for the manufacturer and they'll tell you the exact length, the shape, everything else. The sandpaper is simply attached with some Velcro, so I'm going to go ahead and pull that off. So the next thing I did is I put the new sandpaper underneath. This is the old sandpaper that I have clamped down with a couple blocks of wood. I'm going to go through and mark that with a Sharpie, and I'm going to cut it off with a blade. One thing you'll notice is that on this paper there are directional arrows. It also tells you P40, which is the grit. It's the manufacturer's warnings and everything else as well. But when you're buying this, make sure that your directional arrows are pointing the correct direction. So there we have it. The new piece of sandpaper cut. Let's go wind this thing. So our drum currently spins, what would that be, counterclockwise or anti-clockwise if you're a Brit. And I actually drew a directional arrow over there with a Sharpie for you, just to reference. I'm going to start by winding the far side. The directional arrows are pointing the right direction, and I like to wind it on loosely and then go through and retight it. So I'm not the guy that actually installed this Velcro strip right here. You notice how there's some gaps in here. At some point I might get the time to go through and reinstall this, but what I'm doing here is I'm actually just going through and I'm actually gradually working the sandpaper on. And ideally, when one layer overlaps the other layer, this should not happen. So you need to make sure that the two layers actually do not overlap, and sometimes you have to back it off and rewind it a little bit. So there you go. That's how it should look. If you see right here that there's just ever so subtle of a gap in between this winding and that winding, what'll happen is as this sands, this actually will tighten up a little bit, but you do not want the two layers to overlap each other at all. So there you have it. I went through and rewound it. If you notice on this side here how I have a little bit of a gap, I'm going to go ahead and work it back and forth and try to close that gap up. And we're going to put the machine back together. Next thing I like to do is close the lid on the machine. And I like to start and stop the machine to make sure it sounds right and it did it right. So I'm going to close this lid. If you turn the machine on and off, so I just push the power button real quick. I turn it off. And you're going to know real quick if you installed the sandpaper correctly or incorrectly. So there's our drum. It's still intact. Let's go ahead and close it up and we'll get sanding.